Hi there, my name is Joe Wiskerta, and I'm applying to be an Ableton Certified Instructor. Unfortunately, I don't have any video of me teaching my classes at the UC Davis Experimental College. So what I've done is I've recreated a quick lecture that I normally give to my beginning students when we talk about beginning synthesis. So without further ado, an introduction to synthesis. So when I first start talking about synthesis, what I usually start with is the subtractive model. You can kind of think of subtractive synthesis as a sculptor starting with a block of clay and then using his various tools to scrape, or her various tools to scrape and sculpt away parts of the clay to create the art. Subtractive synthesis works very similarly in that you start with a noisemaker, which is we call an oscillator, and this is your block of clay in essence, and you have your scraping and cutting tools and your filters. So the filters basically cut away parts of the sound from the oscillator, and at the end we've got an amplifier to help turn it up so we can hear it. So the reason we talk about subtractive first generally is that even though there are all different sorts of synthesizers out there, in my experience, all of them tend to use some bit of the subtractive model in the way that they're set up. So there are other elements to subtractive synthesis, namely LFOs and envelopes. These things are called modulators, and what they do is essentially they are something that wiggles something else. LFO stands for low frequency oscillator, and this is basically a function that repeats in time. The envelope is a little bit different of an animal. It's kind of a one-shot wiggler. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So that's sort of it in a nutshell. You've got oscillators, you've got filters cutting away parts of the sound from the oscillators, and amplifiers turning things up, and LFOs and envelopes wiggling everything. What we're going to do is we're going to use the Ableton Live virtual analog synthesizer to help demonstrate some of these concepts. But before we do that, I'd like to first get into some of the things that we're going to see, not only in analog, but in other synthesizers again and again and again. So without further ado, I'd like to talk about some basic filter types. So as you can see, I've drawn a bunch of X and Y axes. The Y-axis stands for volume, and the X-axis has an F on it, which stands for frequency. And nominally this is going to be from 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz, the range of human hearing. And as you can see, there's like a bump at either the center or at where the low pass and high pass filters start and end. And that is, I've marked that off as a C. That's called the cutoff frequency in the case of a low pass or high pass filter, or a center frequency in the case of a band pass or notch filter. So what a low pass filter does is it lets all the lower frequency sounds through, but cuts off all the high frequency ones. The high pass filter does exactly the opposite. It lets all the high frequency sounds through and cuts out all the low ones. The band pass filter allows a bunch of frequencies, a narrow band of frequencies rather, around center frequency to pass through, but cuts out everything else. And the notch is sort of the mirror image of the band pass filter. It lets everything through except for a notch of frequencies centered around a center frequency. So we're going to see these in analog, and you're probably going to see these again and again and again in not only subtractive synthesizers, but all kinds of other synthesizers too. So some other nomenclature I'd like to talk about before we get into analog is the terms that we use to describe envelopes. We have these things that we use to describe envelopes called ADSR curves. ADSR stands for attack, decay, sustain, and release. Attack and decay are measured in units of time, so is release. Sustain is measured in units of whatever amplitude you're working with. Sorry, hold on. There we go. I'm going to draw this back in a second. So the amplitude is basically, the amplitude A is basically the magnitude of whatever the envelope is trying to affect, and that's on the y-axis here, and on the x-axis we have t, which is time. So if we think about how a sound is created, maybe like striking a piano key, we know that the sound, as it progresses through time, goes from zero volume to some maximum volume really quickly. And then as you continue to hold the note in the piano key, it drops down until it gets to some volume where it sustains that for a little bit, and then when you release the piano key, the sound tends to fade out. So the amount of time it takes to go from zero sound to maximum is the attack time. We can see that here. The amount of time it takes for the sound to decay from the maximum to the sustain, the point where the sound is sustained, is the decay time, and that's right here. The sustain is measured in amplitude, and that's right here. Sustain is going to be the amount it's held at, and then release is the amount of time it takes for the sound to completely fade out. So these sort of envelopes can be abstracted to basically affect anything, but the one that's really good to think about in terms of getting an idea of what an envelope is the one that we're going to see in pretty much all synthesizers, which is the amplifier envelope. It's kind of what I just described. It is the envelope that affects the amplifier, or how loud the sound progresses in time. So in terms of an amplifier envelope, the amplitude here is going to become our volume V. I'll draw that back in. There we go. So, and just following along with the whole idea of hitting and holding a piano note, we've got an attack and a decay time, a sustained volume, and a release time. Other things that are good to think about when we're going into a synthesizer for the first time, or trying to explore a new one, is the architecture of the synthesizer. How these modules are connected together. Is that fixed, or are we allowed some freedom with it? If it is fixed, then we call that a fixed architecture. If we're allowed some freedom, we call that a modular architecture, or semi-modular. Another thing to think about when we're delving into a synthesizer for the first time is the modulation routing, or the modulation matrix. What sort of tools does the synthesizer give you for the modulators, the LFOs, and the envelopes to affect qualities in the oscillators, and the filters, and the amplifiers, as well as the LFOs and the envelopes themselves? We're going to explore this a little bit when we go switch up, and I'm going to go to my computer right now, and we're going to open up Analog. Hey there, this is Joe Wiskerta. I'm back with you. I've got a session of Ableton Live opened. We're going to continue our exploration of basic synthesis using the virtual analog synthesizer. And how we're going to do this is by identifying the important components that we just talked about. So let me go ahead and begin. First, I'm going to create a new MIDI track that Analog is going to go in. Analog lives over in the Instruments section here in the browser, and to bring in an initialized brand new copy, you simply go ahead and click on Analog and drag it into the MIDI track. So here's what Analog looks like when you first bring it in. So it looks like a lot of the important components that we want to identify are actually fairly obvious. Let me tell you a little bit about Analog before we start. Analog is a 2 oscillator, 2 filter, 2 amplifier, and 2 LFO virtual analog synthesizer. And by bringing it in, we can see that a lot of the important components that we're looking for, namely the oscillators and the filters and the amplifiers, are clearly labeled.
and easily identifiable. So there's half the battle in learning how to drive this new synth. Oh, looks like the LFOs are also clearly labeled too as well. So we've got the oscillators, filters, and amplifier locations identified. LFOs. Um, let's go ahead and explore these things a little bit first. And I'd like to go ahead and start basic. So I'm going to click on the background in this volume section to bring up analog as it first appears. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to establish the routing or the architecture between the different modules. Analog is semi-modular, meaning it gives you a few options on how the different oscillators and filters are hooked together. And that's done under this section here called quick routing. What I'd like to do is I'd like to pick a really basic form of architecture into the quick routing, that in which the oscillator, filter, and amplifier 1 and 2 are routed independently of each other and are mixed down here at the volume section. Under quick routing, the signal flow goes from left to right. So we can see the signal starts here at the oscillator, feeds into the filter, and then goes into the amplifier. So we're going to go ahead and select this one. And to make it a little bit more basic, I'm going to turn section 2 off. So, and I'm going to go ahead and turn the LFO off because we're not going to use that for now. So, what I'd like to do, and let's go ahead and turn the filter off, get really basic. So we just have an oscillator feeding into an amplifier. Let's see what kind of options analog gives us. Analog under the oscillator section gives us 4 different analog forms. The first one is sine, which is really pure. It's just, a really, really narrow band of frequencies or a single frequency. The next form, the sawtooth, sounds quite a bit more buzzy and ringy and has quite a bit more harmonics in it. The square wave sounds a little bit more hollow than the sawtooth, has a few less harmonics, and the last waveform that it offers us is straight up noise. The other controls that exist in the oscillator section are the octave, semi, and detuning, which determine the pitch of the oscillator. So I can change that in my keyboard, but I can also change it here. So let me go ahead and move over to the filter section. Let me turn that on. Now remember, we talked about some different kinds of filters in our last little bit of the lecture. The different filters are selectable right here, and it opens up and we can see we have low-pass filters. The 12 dB per octave is a little bit less steep than the 24 dB per octave. It's going to be a little bit more gradual. But as we can see, we're given options for low pass, band pass, notch, and high pass, just like we talked about. We're also given an option for another different kinds of filter called a Foreman filter. The characteristics of the Foreman filter is it sort of resembles a human voice. So let's start off with a basic one, low pass. And let's use the controls, the frequency, which is the cutoff frequency of the filter. Let's change that around and see what kind of different sounds we can get. So as I bring it down, remember a low-pass filter only lets the low frequencies through, so we're only hearing the low part. Now we're hearing the upper part. This resonance control basically controls how big the bump is at the cutoff. So bringing the resonance up, we're not hearing too much because we're using sine. Let's go ahead and change this to a sawtooth. Oh, now we're really hearing something. Let's bring the resonance back down. So now it's a shallow bump. Now that bump's going up. Cool. So that's low pass. Here's high pass, which only lets the high parts of the sound through. And it goes away as we bring it up. And you can hear what resonance does. The band pass, remember, only lets frequencies around a narrow band through. That's kind of what that sounds like. And the notch was the opposite of bandpass. And that's what a notch filter sounds like. So we've identified where the filter section is, and we've identified the amplifier section. Let's go ahead and click in the background in the amplifier section, because there's one thing we still haven't identified, and those are the envelopes, which are the other important modulator. Remember we talked about the amplifier envelope, which is going to be found in pretty much every synthesizer, and I feel like it's a really, really important part of determining the characteristics of the overall sound. So let's go ahead and explore the ADSR curve, the attack, decay, sustain, and release curve for the amplifier. And it gets brought up when we click on the background of the amplifier section, and we can see we have controls for attack, decay, sustain, and release. These controls can also be manipulated graphically. So when I bring the attack time up, you can hear it's taking a little bit to ramp up. By moving the second control, I can control the decay time and the sustain. Remember, in sustain, in the case of the amplifier envelope, is volume. And then I can use this last graphical control to control the release. So there's the amplifier envelope. If we go ahead and we click on the LFO, we can explore that a little bit. And by clicking on the LFO, it brings up some menus for some of the different LFO options here. Now remember what the LFO is it's a modulator or a wiggler of, and it's one that repeats itself in time. If we click on the wave section here, it gives us several different options for different repeating patterns: sines, triangles, rectangles, and even noise. So let's go with the sine. And now that the LFO is active, the other thing we want to identify is how the modulators affect the various different parameters in oscillator, filter, and amplifier. Basically, the modulation matrix, as it were. So if we go ahead and click on the background of the filter section, we can see there are a couple of different places where the LFO1 get mentioned under the frequency modulation and resonance modulation. If we increase the LFO, there we go. Now we're hearing the LFO1 wiggling the filter frequency of filter 1. Okay, well that's a good introduction. We're going to continue on exploring, some of the other aspects of analog, but we'll do that in a future lecture. Hope you've enjoyed this. Thank you.